83 seconds. That's how long complete silence lasted in a Senate confirmation hearing after Senator Elizabeth Warren presented $847,000 worth of documented Russian financial connections. 83 seconds where cameras captured every uncomfortable shift, every avoided glance, every moment where a response should have existed but didn't. We're talking about a confirmation hearing in January 2026 where the most damaging revelation wasn't what was said, but what couldn't be said back. Before we dive into how we got to this unprecedented moment, I need to ask you something. What state are you watching from right now? Because regardless of where you live, what happened in that Senate hearing room affects every single American's faith in our institutions. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about whether our confirmation process can still hold nominees accountable when faced with irrefutable evidence. Here's what you need to understand about confirmation hearings. Nominees prepare for months. They anticipate every possible question, rehearse every conceivable attack, coordinate with teams of lawyers and political operatives to craft responses that deflect, defend, or redirect. The silence we witnessed wasn't preparation failing. It was preparation determining that no response could possibly make the situation better. The Senate Judiciary Committee had seen contentious confirmations before. They'd witnessed nominees stumble under pressure, deliver evasive answers, even attempt to mislead the committee, but they had never seen a nominee choose complete silence when presented with specific financial documentation. They had never witnessed a moment where the evidence was so comprehensive, so methodically assembled, that silence became the only strategic option available. What Warren had discovered wasn't just another conflict of interest controversy. This was systematic documentation of financial relationships that directly contradicted previous sworn testimony about foreign influence. The kind of evidence that doesn't leave room for explanations, clarifications, or alternative interpretations. The kind that transforms a routine confirmation hearing into a moment of institutional reckoning. Those 83 seconds of silence represented something unprecedented in American political accountability, not just because of what they revealed about one nominee, but because of what they demonstrated about what happens when thorough preparation meets systematic corruption. When months of methodical investigation collide with years of careful financial obfuscation, the confirmation process was designed to vet nominees for the highest positions in our government. But what happened in January 2026 exposed how that process could be weaponized by someone willing to do the actual work of accountability. Warren didn't just ask tough questions. She presented irrefutable documentation that made tough questions unnecessary. This is the story of how 83 seconds of silence shattered assumptions about political accountability. How one senator's methodical investigation created a moment so devastating that no response was possible, and how that silence spoke louder than any defense ever could. What you're about to witness isn't just the anatomy of a political confrontation, it's the blueprint for what institutional accountability looks like when someone actually does the work. Warren didn't stumble onto $847,000 in Russian financial connections by accident. This was months of methodical investigation, the kind of painstaking document analysis that most senators don't have the patience or staff resources to conduct. But Warren had both, and she had something else that proved decisive: an understanding that confirmation hearings had become political theater precisely because nobody did the actual work anymore. The trail began in October 2025, 3 months before the confirmation hearing that would create those 83 seconds of silence. Warren's staff had identified a pattern in Bondi's financial disclosures that didn't align with her public statements about foreign influence. Not obvious contradictions, subtle inconsistencies that required cross-referencing international business filings with domestic financial records. Here's what they discovered. Between 2019 and 2023, Bondi had received payments totaling $847,000 through a network of shell companies ultimately traceable to Russian business interests. Not direct payments from Moscow, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they found a sophisticated money laundering operation that moved funds through Delaware corporations, Cayman Islands subsidiaries, and British Virgin Islands holding companies before finally reaching Bondi's consulting firm. The methodology Warren's team used wasn't revolutionary, it was just thorough. They obtained corporate filings from multiple jurisdictions. They traced wire transfer records through international banking networks. They cross-referenced payment dates with Bondi's calendar of public statements about Russian sanctions and foreign interference. They built a timeline that showed Bondi making increasingly favorable comments about Russian business practices precisely during the periods when these payments were flowing through the shell company network. This wasn't circumstantial evidence. This was documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. Warren had learned from previous confirmation controversies where nominees survived because the evidence wasn't comprehensive enough to prevent alternative explanations. She made sure that wouldn't happen this time. Bondi's previous statements about foreign influence made the financial connections especially damaging. In 2021, she had testified before Congress that any American accepting money from Russian sources while advocating for policy positions favorable to Russia represented a fundamental threat to national security. In 2022, she had written an op-ed calling for enhanced scrutiny of financial relationships between American political figures and foreign governments. In 2023, she had supported legislation requiring disclosure of any payments exceeding $10,000 from foreign connected entities. The irony was devastating. Bondi had built her reputation as a hawk on foreign influence while simultaneously receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the exact type of financial network she publicly condemned. Warren's investigation revealed not just hypocrisy, but systematic deception that spanned multiple years and involved deliberate concealment of financial relationships. The shell company structure was particularly sophisticated. The Russian business interests that ultimately funded Bondi's payments had created layers of corporate entities designed specifically to obscure the money's origin. Funds would originate from Russian energy companies, flow through Cyprus-based holding companies, transfer to Delaware corporations with generic names like Atlantic Business Solutions and Meridian Consulting Group, then finally reach Bondi's firm through seemingly routine consulting contracts. Warren's team traced every transfer. They identified the Russian executives who authorized the original payments. They documented the dates when funds entered and exited each shell company. They proved that Bondi's consulting firm had received these payments despite having no apparent business relationship with the American subsidiaries that issued the payments. The consulting contracts were revealed as facades designed to legitimize what was essentially a Russian influence operation. By December 2025, Warren had assembled a comprehensive file that included bank records, corporate filings, wire transfer documentation, and a detailed timeline connecting Bondi's policy positions to the payments she was receiving. The evidence was so methodically documented that it precluded any defense based on lack of knowledge or unintentional oversight. Bondi either knew about these financial relationships and concealed them, or she had engaged in financial arrangements so complex that ignorance wasn't a credible explanation. Warren understood that confirmation hearings had become exercises in political theater because senators typically asked broad questions that allowed nominees to provide evasive answers. She decided to eliminate that possibility. Instead of asking whether Bondi had any financial relationships with foreign entities, Warren would present specific dollar amounts, exact dates, and documented transfers that made denial impossible and explanations irrelevant. The preparation took months because Warren knew she would only get one opportunity. If the evidence wasn't comprehensive enough to survive immediate scrutiny, Bondi would recover and the confirmation would proceed. But if the evidence was methodical and irrefutable, it would create a moment of accountability that had become almost extinct in modern confirmation processes. What Warren had created wasn't just opposition research. It was a blueprint for what institutional accountability looks like when someone actually does the investigative work that the confirmation process was designed to require but had largely abandoned. January 7th, 2026, 10:37 a.m. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed with the usual suspects: reporters, lobbyists, political operatives, and the kind of Washington insiders who treat confirmation hearings like theater performances. Bondi sat at the witness table with the confident posture of someone who had survived dozens of similar confrontations. Her legal team had prepared her for aggressive questioning, hostile cross-examination, and political grandstanding. They had not prepared her for what Warren was about to deploy. Warren's opening was deceptively calm. No dramatic flourishes, no rhetorical buildup. She simply began reading from a manila folder that contained months of methodical investigation. Ms. Bondi, I want to discuss your financial relationships with foreign entities during the period from 2019 to 2023. Bondi's response was textbook political deflection. She had reviewed her financial disclosures thoroughly, consulted with ethics lawyers, and remained confident that her business relationships met all legal requirements. The standard playbook for confirmation controversies. Acknowledge the question, express confidence in legal compliance, redirect toward qualifications for the position. Warren nodded and continued reading. On March 15, 2019, Atlantic Business Solutions transferred $82,000 to your consulting firm. Atlantic Business Solutions is a Delaware corporation wholly owned by Meridian Holdings, which is registered in the Cayman Islands. Meridian Holdings receives its funding from Cyprus-based Petrov Industries, which is controlled by Russian energy executives currently under federal sanctions. The room got quieter. Bondi's confident expression didn't change, but her legal team began exchanging glances. This wasn't the typical confirmation hearing questioning pattern. Warren was presenting specific amounts, exact dates, and documented corporate relationships that couldn't be dismissed as partisan attacks or misunderstandings. Warren kept reading. On June 8, 2019, another transfer, $75,000 from Coastal Consulting Group to your firm. Coastal Consulting Group traces back through the same shell company network to the same Russian funding sources. On September 22, 2019, $68,000 from Strategic Advisory Partners. Same ultimate source. Committee members were leaning forward now. Even senators from Bondi's own party were paying attention in ways that suggested this wasn't typical opposition research. Warren's documentation was too specific, too methodical, too comprehensive to be anything other than legitimate financial investigation. October 2019, $91,000. January 2020, $86,000. April 2020, $73,000. Warren continued through the timeline, each payment documented with precision that precluded any defense based on lack of knowledge or unintentional oversight. The total documented transfers from Russian-controlled entities to your consulting firm through this shell company network amount to $847,000 over 4 years. Bondi had stopped responding entirely. Her legal team was furiously taking notes, but they weren't whispering advice about how to address Warren's allegations. They were documenting the allegations themselves, apparently recognizing that the evidence was too detailed to challenge in real time. Warren looked up from her folder for the first time since beginning her presentation. Ms. Bondi, during this same period when you were receiving these payments, you testified before Congress that Americans accepting money from Russian sources while advocating for policies favorable to Russia represented a fundamental threat to national security. You wrote op-eds calling for enhanced scrutiny of financial relationships between American political figures and foreign governments. You supported legislation requiring disclosure of payments exceeding $10,000 from foreign-connected entities. The silence in the room was becoming uncomfortable. Confirmation hearings typically feature constant back and forth between senators and nominees, interruptions from committee chairs, procedural objections, and political theater that keeps the proceedings moving. But Warren's systematic presentation of documented evidence had created something unprecedented. A moment where political theater was impossible because the evidence was too comprehensive to deflect. Ms. Bondi, can you explain why your consulting firm received $847,000 from Russian-controlled entities while you were publicly advocating for enhanced scrutiny of exactly these types of financial relationships? Bondi looked at her legal team. Her legal team looked at the documents Warren had been reading from. The committee looked at Bondi. The cameras captured every moment of the growing realization that no adequate response existed. 83 seconds of complete silence. Warren didn't interrupt it. The committee chair didn't call for a recess. The cameras kept rolling. 83 seconds where the most powerful response to months of methodical investigation was no response at all. When Bondi finally spoke, it wasn't to address Warren's question. Senator Warren, I want to thank you for bringing these concerns to my attention. I will review these matters with my legal counsel and provide appropriate responses through proper channels. Warren nodded. The documentation is available for your review. Banking records, corporate filings, wire transfer details, and the timeline connecting these payments to your public policy positions, all of it. She closed the manila folder. No further questions. The hearing room remained silent for several more seconds before the committee chair called for a brief recess. But the damage was complete. In less than 10 minutes, Warren had presented evidence so methodical and comprehensive that silence became the only strategic option available to the nominee. Those 83 seconds of silence would be replayed on every news network, analyzed by every political commentator, and cited as evidence of what happens when actual accountability meets systematic corruption. The silence spoke louder than any defense could have. The hearing room had barely emptied before the first breaking news alert started flooding newsrooms across Washington. 83 seconds of silence in response to documented Russian financial connections wasn't just unprecedented in confirmation hearing history, it was the kind of moment that political reporters spend their entire careers waiting to witness. CNN's chief political correspondent was on air within 15 minutes. I've covered confirmation hearings for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like what just happened in that Senate committee room. When a nominee chooses complete silence rather than address specific financial allegations, it tells you everything about the strength of the evidence being presented. But the media reaction was only the beginning. Within an hour of Warren's presentation, senators from both parties were making calculated decisions about their own political positioning. Republican committee members who had been prepared to support Bondi's confirmation were suddenly requesting private briefings on Warren's documentation. Democratic senators who hadn't been particularly focused on the confirmation were calling press conferences to demand full disclosure of all foreign financial relationships. Senator Mike Braun, who had planned to deliver a strong endorsement of Bondi during the afternoon session, instead issued a carefully worded statement about the need for additional review of any concerning financial relationships. Senator Susan Collins, known for her deliberative approach to controversial nominations, announced that she would be requesting a complete audit of all documentation before proceeding with any confirmation vote. The strategic repositioning wasn't limited to individual senators. The entire confirmation process was suddenly facing questions that went far beyond one nominee's financial relationships. If Warren's investigation could uncover $847,000 in Russian connections that had previously escaped scrutiny, what did that reveal about the adequacy of existing vetting procedures? Chuck Grassley, the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee, found himself in an impossible position. His party controlled the confirmation process, but Warren's evidence was too methodical to dismiss as partisan opposition research. During the afternoon recess, Grassley huddled with committee staff to review the documentation Warren had presented. What they found wasn't opposition research. It was legitimate financial investigation that revealed systematic failures in the confirmation vetting process. The White House response was equally telling. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre had been prepared to defend Bondi's qualifications and dismiss any political attacks on her record. But when reporters asked about specific Russian financial connections totaling $847,000, Jean-Pierre found herself in the same position as Bondi. The evidence was too specific and too documented to address with standard political deflection. We are reviewing the materials presented by Senator Warren and will provide appropriate responses through proper channels, became the White House's official statement. The same non-response that Bondi had offered during those 83 seconds of silence. Legal experts across Washington were reaching the same conclusion. Former federal prosecutor Barbara McQuade appeared on MSNBC that evening with an analysis that captured what many were thinking but few were saying publicly. When presented with specific financial documentation, nominees typically offer explanations, clarifications, or denials. Complete silence suggests that no legally safe response exists. That's not a political calculation. That's a legal one. The international reaction was swift and significant. European intelligence agencies that had been tracking Russian influence operations were requesting copies of Warren's documentation. If American confirmation processes had failed to identify $847,000 in Russian financial connections, what similar relationships had escaped detection in other Western democracies? British intelligence officials privately confirmed that they had identified similar shell company networks operating throughout Europe, but hadn't realized the extent of their penetration into American political institutions. The Warren investigation wasn't just exposing one nominee's financial relationships. It was revealing the sophistication of Russian influence operations that had previously operated below detection thresholds. Behind the scenes, political operatives were conducting urgent reviews of their own clients' financial relationships. If Warren's investigation methodology could be applied to other political figures, how many similar financial connections might exist? Law firms specializing in political compliance were fielding panicked calls from clients demanding immediate audits of their international business relationships. The precedent Warren had established was terrifying for anyone with complex international financial arrangements. Her investigation had demonstrated that sophisticated money laundering networks could be traced through multiple jurisdictions and corporate entities. The kind of financial privacy that had previously protected political figures from scrutiny was suddenly vulnerable to methodical investigation. Committee staff were already discussing procedural changes for future confirmation hearings. The standard financial disclosure forms that nominees submitted were clearly inadequate if they had failed to capture $847,000 in Russian connections. New requirements for international financial audits, enhanced disclosure of shell company relationships, and mandatory review of foreign business connections were being drafted before the hearing had even concluded. The confirmation process itself was facing institutional questions that extended far beyond Bondi's nomination. If the existing vetting procedures were insufficient to identify systematic foreign financial relationships, how many previous confirmations had proceeded without adequate scrutiny? The implications weren't just prospective, they were retrospective. Senator Lindsey Graham, who chaired the Judiciary Committee during the previous administration, was already facing calls to review confirmations that had proceeded under his leadership. Had similar financial relationships escaped detection because senators weren't conducting the kind of methodical investigation that Warren had demonstrated? The 83 seconds of silence had created something unprecedented in Washington. A moment where political spin was impossible because the evidence was too comprehensive to deflect. Warren's investigation had established a new standard for confirmation accountability that would be impossible to ignore in future nominations. But the most significant ripple effect was institutional. Warren had demonstrated that confirmation hearings could still serve their intended purpose of holding nominees accountable, but only if senators were willing to conduct actual investigations rather than relying on political theater. The systematic preparation she had undertaken wasn't revolutionary, it was just thorough, and it had revealed how much accountability had been lost when senators stopped doing the actual work. The precedent was clear. Future nominees would face the possibility that their financial relationships could be subjected to the same methodical investigation that Warren had conducted. The confirmation process had been fundamentally changed by one senator's willingness to do comprehensive research rather than settle for superficial questioning. The most telling aspect of those 83 seconds wasn't the silence itself. It was the calculated decision that silence represented the best available option. Legal experts who have spent decades analyzing political crisis management recognized immediately what they were witnessing. A nominee and her legal team making the strategic calculation that no response was safer than any possible response. Former White House counsel Catherine Rumler appeared on Meet the Press that Sunday with an analysis that captured what many legal professionals were thinking. When you're presented with specific financial documentation in a confirmation hearing, you have three options: deny the allegations, explain the circumstances, or remain silent. Denial requires the allegations to be false. Explanation requires the circumstances to be defensible. Silence is what you choose when neither option is legally safe. The legal implications of Bondi's non-response were unprecedented in confirmation hearing history. Nominees routinely face allegations of impropriety, conflicts of interest, and questionable business relationships, but they typically respond with denials, clarifications, or contextual explanations that provide political cover for senators who want to support their confirmation.